The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening, Chris. Thank you very, very much. In November 1981, the United States invaded Egypt by air. 850 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne in North Carolina. They flew, look at that. They flew from North Carolina to Egypt and dropped out of the sky all at once.
14 hours after taking off from North Carolina, American paratroopers landed in the Egyptian desert. It was the biggest test so far for the Rapid Deployment Force. 850 members of the 82nd Airborne, 10 Egyptian paratroopers, and tons of weapons and equipment were over the drop site precisely on time and on the ground 6 minutes later. There were 4 injuries, the most serious a broken hip. B-52s dropped 500-pound bombs from 600 feet above the Egyptian desert. A-10 Thunderbolts and F-16s bombed and strafed desert targets. And above it all, an AWACS kept track of the war games. The 6 B-52s flew 7,000 miles nonstop from North Dakota to hit the target 70 miles from Cairo.
That was November 1981, a fake war in Egypt. It apparently cost one paratrooper a broken hip, but otherwise it was considered a big success. And we have been holding big fake wars in Egypt ever since. The first one was actually in 1980. After Egypt signed a peace treaty with Israel, we held a fake war with Egypt, a big military joint training exercise in 1980. And then again, we did that really big one in 1981. And then everybody had so much fun, and it started to turn into such a big operation with so many tens of thousands of troops participating from an ever-increasing list of countries that they decided they were going to have to hold this thing every 2 years instead of every year because it took so long to plan and it was so expensive to do. But we have been doing it biannually every couple of years ever since. The basic idea is that, well, in part, war games are fun for militaries. Gets to keep everybody on their toes. I'm sure those B-52 pilots in the desert were probably psyched to be able to drop live fire 500-pound bombs in an unfamiliar place instead of just the same old training runs at home. But also, think about when these started. 1980, 1981... peak years of the Cold War, right? When the U.S. and the Soviet Union were trying to divide the world between them and us. Everybody expanding their spheres of influence, right? The U.S. and the USSR pressuring all the other countries in the world to either ally with the West or ally with the East. And so cementing military ties for the West and Egypt, which has the biggest population in the Middle East, in many ways the strongest Arab nation. Yeah, that was a reward for them signing a peace treaty with Israel, but it was also a way to keep them in the West, to keep them on our side of the big game. And so now, even today, the Egyptian military uses Abrams tanks built by General Dynamics. They fly Boeing Apache attack helicopters. Their fighter jet pilots fly Lockheed Martin F-16s. And every 2 years since the early 1980s, these giant war games, these giant fake wars in Egypt, they further cement the military relationships between Egypt and the West. They cement the interoperability of Egypt's troops with American troops, and now all the other countries that participate or that formally observe those war games, too. By 1999, there were 70,000 troops taking part in the biannual fake war in Egypt. That year, 11 countries had troops participating. Another 30 or so countries were there to formally observe the fake war. The fake war plan that year, 1999, was to defend Egypt from a made-up country called Orange Land. And in the war game plan, Orange Land had invaded and was trying to take control of the Nile. And so the Allies had to work together to defeat the fake Orange Land forces. I hope the Dutch weren't offended, or Syracuse. In the 30-plus years that we have been staging these fake wars, Operation Bright Star, fake wars in Egypt, the fake war has only been called off a handful of times, and it's usually called off because of a real war. Operation Bright Star was called off in 1992 because of the first Gulf War, when Iraq invaded Kuwait and then the U.S. invaded Iraq. Again, in 2003, we were too busy invading Iraq for a second time to bother with fake invading Egypt or helping Egypt fend off some other fake invader. Then again, though, in 2011, it was called off. In the midst of the Arab Spring, Egypt itself was too busy having a real national crisis to bother with pretending to have another one. Egypt's protesting in the streets, overthrowing their own government, deposing the dictator Hosni Mubarak after more than 3 decades in power. Since then, Egyptians have elected and installed and overthrown another government. And now with the military in charge, this military in which we have invested decades in our interrelationship, billions of dollars in equipment, more than $1 billion in additional military aid every year. Now with that close ally to our military in charge of Egypt, this week blood runs in the streets of that country. Yesterday in Cairo and Suez and Alexandria. Today in Cairo again, in Giza, in the shadow of the pyramids. Across Egypt, the supporters of the most recently ousted president from the Muslim Brotherhood, Mohamed Morsi, were cut down for a second day in the streets by police and troops under control of the military that now runs that country. Yesterday's death toll is now considered to be over 600 people killed. Today's death toll is not yet clear. In response to the violence, President Obama today interrupted his vacation to make a formal statement and to call off this year's Operation Bright Star in Egypt.
While we want to sustain our relationship with Egypt, our traditional cooperation cannot continue as usual when civilians are being killed in the streets and rights are being rolled back. As a result, this morning we notified the Egyptian government that we are canceling our biannual joint military exercise, which was scheduled for next month.
In 3 decades, the only other times we have canceled our biannual fake wars with Egypt were for real wars and real revolutions. Is what's happening in Egypt right now either of those things? And what has our close, very close relationship with that country's military bought us now in terms of influence, now that the military is in charge of that country? And what other options do we have that might make any difference at all to what is happening in that country's streets? Joining us now live from Cairo is NBC News correspondent Ayman Mohaldin. Ayman, thank you so much for staying up into the middle of the night to be with us. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Rachel.
What can you tell us about the situation in Cairo and around Egypt today compared with yesterday, whether it seems like the situation is settling down at all or whether it's going to continue the way it has been?
Well, 2 things. One, the scope of what happened yesterday is still being realized today on a humanitarian level and on a political level. When we're talking about the death toll, yesterday we didn't have a sense of how bad it was going to be. Yes, the Muslim Brotherhood was saying thousands of its supporters were killed. The death tolls began very low from the official government sources. But by the end of today, we are still getting a better picture of the kind of human toll these casualties, or rather these crackdowns, have resulted in. We're looking at a number of about 600 or so killed so far. There are still hundreds of bodies that are laying in a mosque that are still unidentified, unaccounted for. So people are expecting that number to go up in the coming hours, perhaps as early as tomorrow morning. And against that backdrop, a tremendous amount of political uncertainty here. Today, the government ratcheting up its use of force, saying they will use live ammunition against protesters if, in fact, these protesters continue to try and attack government buildings, churches, police stations, courthouses, like we saw today. So there is no backing down on either side, and it has created a second night of anxiety here in the capital, Cairo, and across the country for the second night of also the emergency law and curfew that has been imposed here.
I mean, obviously, the 2 sides here are the government, police and security forces, the military on one side, and on the other side, the Muslim Brotherhood, the supporters of the ousted president, Mohamed Morsi. What about everybody else? How is the general public coping? People who are anti-Morsi but not part of the government, people who may not have participated in a protest throughout any of these protests over the last few years. How are people generally anticipating coping with this?
Well, this is exactly what makes the situation on the ground so complex. The word that everybody uses to describe Egypt these days, polarized. Egypt is a polarized country today because everybody on one hand has some legitimacy and correct assumptions in their argument, but they're also incorrect. And as you mentioned, the people that are caught in the middle, ordinary Egyptians, are divided. On one hand, over the year of the term of President Mohamed Morsi, Egyptians grew frustrated with his rule. They were not happy with his undemocratic governance system. More importantly, the economy got worse. And for ordinary Egyptians, they simply wanted their lives to get better. That did not happen. And that's why a popular revolt took place on June 30th. The military, on the other hand, has interpreted that as a mandate for it to return to power, and in some cases abuse that mandate that was given to it in cracking down on protests like we've seen. So it has angered some Egyptians, and that's why many people here are very cautious about the return of the military in a very strong way, dominating the country's politics, attempting to try and put back its role in Egyptian society. The question or not really that everyone is worried about is how genuine will the military be. Now, there were some reasons to believe the military was going to be genuine, but when we see incidents like yesterday unfold, it gives people here a moment of pause. They lived under military rule for 60 years, so there is growing concern that perhaps the military's actions over the past 48 hours is going to set this country back on a whole host of issues, most importantly civil liberties, individual freedoms, political gains that have been realized since 2011. But make no mistake about it, the Muslim Brotherhood is not popular. People are not rallying behind them. People rejected what they did over the course of the last year and over the course of the last several weeks. The anger, though, is divided between how they governed and whether or not what happened yesterday was a proportionate use of force to try and restore security across the country.
And that will continue, of course, to get more and more acute, that sense, as the security forces, as you say, pledge to use live fire and not to back down at all. This is just an incredibly tense situation. NBC News correspondent Ayman Mohaldin. Ayman, thank you again for staying up with us into the middle of the night. I really appreciate it. Stay safe.
You're welcome. Thanks.
All right. There's a lot of other news in the world today, including an incredibly excellent bot job by the rightest of the right-wing corners of the American political world. A screw-up that gets very close to the all-important issue of the X-Men. And that story is coming up.